pretty clearly, if we're talking about trying to ease the transition from prototyping to production, this pro² notion that we have, then in some sense, we're looking to see a bigger range of devices available in the world for people to use, like a long tail of devices, as it were. So I'm going to talk a little bit, first of all, about why we think that's a really useful thing to enable. And so I'm going to start with this chap, George Zipf. He was an American linguist at the beginning of the previous century, working at Harvard. And he was studying words, and in particular, he was interested in the frequency of words. So what he did was he got a book, and he would count up the frequency of words in that book and plot them on a graph. We call this type of graph a rank frequency distribution. So up on the y-axis here, we have the frequency of occurrence of a word in this case, like the popularity, as it were, of the word, how popular that word is. And what we do along the x-axis, well, at x equals 1, we plot the most popular word. And then at x equals 2, we plot the second most popular and third most popular, and so on. And so in English, it turns out, any book written in English, the most popular word is the. So let's suppose that happens 10,000 times. We're going to plot that at 1, 10,000. Second most popular word is actually of, I believe. And the amazing thing is it happens with half the frequency. The third most popular word happens with a third of the frequency. And so what you get is a graph that looks like this. It's called a inverse power law. And of course, it's not an exact match for every single book, but it's remarkably close. And you might think, well, what's special about English? Well, the answer is nothing special about English. This applies to all languages. So even languages we have not yet been able to translate, ancient languages, we don't necessarily know what the words mean, but we know they follow this distribution. It's called Zipf's law, and it's called a Zipfian distribution. So that's pretty remarkable. But even more remarkable, I think, is it doesn't just apply to words. This distribution applies to populations of countries, populations of cities within countries, right? If you plot the population of the most popular, London, and then follow it by Birmingham and follow through, you get a graph like this. It applies to the wealth of countries, GDP. It applies to the wealth of individuals. It applies to how frequently papers are cited. It applies to the popularity of TV shows. Isn't that amazing? So to be clear, they don't all look exactly like this, but they do follow a slightly more general class of curves. So this is 1 over x I was plotting, and actually this inverse power law is slightly more, 1 over x to the a. But mathematically, the interesting thing about this class of graphs, they're called heavy-tailed functions. And what that means is if you calculate the area under the graph, often you get a graph that looks like it's like an exponential. The area under the graph tends to some limit. But with these heavy-tailed functions, there is no limit. If you keep moving to the right, you'll find more stuff there. So what that means from a more practical perspective is if you're producing TV shows, it doesn't matter how niche the next TV show you make is, there's going to be someone who wants to watch it. So because of the shape of this graph, it often makes sense actually to plot it on a log-log scale. So if we take that graph and do that, it doesn't matter whether it's 1 over x or 1 over x squared or whatever, then we get a straight line. And by representing it like this, it makes it a little bit easier to see what's happening over on the right-hand side. With this long tail, you can imagine if you plot it on linear axes, it's kind of a little bit hard to see the detail of what's happening out on the right. So from here on in the presentation, I'm going to be using log-log scale. So I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about another example of something that follows Zipf's law, and that is the popularity of movies. So this is a plot of movies, the popularity of movies as measured by how much revenue they generated in the box office. In the US, it's only for the US, and it's in 2005, so it's for 1 year. And you can see it's a log-log graph, so it's a straight line. It's following Zipf's law. Like we'd expect, why would movies be any different from TV shows? So what happens, what's interesting is if we extend this out to the right. So the dashed line is what Zipf's law would predict, and the solid line is reality. So what's happening here? Why, in fact, the movies look like they're going to follow Zipf's law and they're not? Well, if you think about it, the answer is pretty obvious, because this is 2005. In 2005, if you wanted to watch a movie, you had to go to the cinema to see it. You couldn't choose anything. You had to choose from the limited list of what was available. So there simply wasn't enough access to enough movies for Zipf's law to apply, as it were, for this long tail to exist. And a guy called Chris Anderson wrote about this in a book he called The Long Tail, and he calls this the gap of unsatisfied demand, as it were, right? There are people there wanting to consume a bigger variety of movies, but they can't because it's not available. Well, it wasn't in 2005. Of course, today it is, because companies like Netflix and others have unlocked that long tail. And when we look at the statistics of the movies that are watched now, there really is a long tail. And what Netflix and others have done is really, if you think about it, they leveraged the latest technology. Obviously, they use internet streaming to deliver these movies. There's a couple of other things as well. They need some way of making money out of it in order to offer this service, and so they use online payment for that. And another key thing, which is a little bit more subtle, but people have to know that movies are out there and be able to find the movies they want to watch. So Netflix introduced, there's a way of searching for different types of movies based on genre, and there are recommender systems that sort of say, well, you might like this, other people like the kind of movies you like, why don't you watch this one? And of course, it's not just movies. We've seen a similar thing with music and with books, e-books, and even with physical objects. So the final example I want to give is software applications. And I don't have numbers for exactly what the shape looks like for software, but one thing is for sure. It's an extremely long tail. In 2018, so that's 5 years ago, Microsoft estimated there were 35 million different Windows apps alone. And of course, this situation didn't happen overnight. What's happened is, I think in particular, in the last 20 years or so, we've developed more and more sophisticated tools and platforms to help software developers, to help with the creation of these applications. So we've got easy programming languages like Python, and we've got development tools like Git, GitHub. We have cloud providers so that you can stand up a cloud service really easily and really cheaply. And of course, ultimately you can monetize and deliver your applications through app stores. So the situation we end up with is we've got some applications that are used in absolutely huge volumes, right? Literally billions of people use these apps. But as we move to the right of this graph, we find that the applications become increasingly, ultimately they become quite niche, right? There are fewer groups of users using them. But it doesn't mean they're not valuable, right? The people who use those applications, might well depend on them. So, use the example, if you need to accelerate some particles in your prototype fusion reactor, you're using some application to do it, right? There might only be a small team of people who ever use that app, but they depend on it. So this is software. What about hardware? What about devices? That's what we're here to talk about, right? Well, of course, things look differently in the hardware industry. I believe it's much more like the movie industry of 2005. We know how to make, as an industry, we know how to make hardware, but the choice we give consumers is limited to these relatively high volume applications on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, there is no long tail because it's hard to design and manufacture and deliver devices, even at low volumes. In fact, especially at low volumes. It's just not cost effective. And so this long tail doesn't exist. But Zipf's law tells us it should, right? There's every reason to believe there's this gap of unsatisfied demand. And that's really, in a nutshell, one of the motivations for pro² is how can we unlock this long tail of hardware?